There is a moment before every great challenge, a moment that decides everything. It's the flicker of doubt, the hesitation before action, that split second where your mind tells you to wait, to hesitate, to second guess. That is where samurai are made or broken. It's not in the battle itself, but in the moment just before. The hesitation is the true enemy. The one who hesitates is already defeated. In the samurai way, there is no place for doubt. There is only clarity, precision, and action. The story of Takashi, a young samurai, begins in this very moment of hesitation. Takashi was born into a world of discipline. He was trained from a young age to master the blade, perfect his form, and become a warrior of unmatched skill. By the age of 22, Takashi was a master of 3 different sword schools, his technique flawless, his reputation growing. The world saw him as a future legend. But in a duel that should have been easy, everything fell apart. Facing a wandering Ronin, a man with no reputation, no noble blood, and no fine weapons, Takashi hesitated. It wasn't even a hesitation in movement, but in his mind, a moment where doubt crept in, a moment where he couldn't decide whether to act or wait. 3 breaths, that's all it took. And in those 3 breaths, the perfect samurai, the future legend, lost everything. His sword flew from his hands before he even realized what happened. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Takashi, a warrior who had trained every day for 15 years, was defeated by a man with nothing but a chipped wooden bokken. It wasn't the loss itself that crushed him, but the realization of where it had come from. He had lost not because he lacked skill or strength, but because, in the most important moment, he hesitated. In that fleeting moment, his years of training, his perfect form, had all been rendered useless. He had hesitated. And hesitation, in the world of a samurai, is death. This was Takashi's awakening. The story of a warrior who had everything, but lacked the one thing that could not be taught in any dojo, the ability to act without hesitation. After the duel, Takashi stood frozen, not from the loss, but from the crushing realization that everything he had trained for had failed him in that critical moment. He had been the Hayashi family's greatest hope, their pride. His technique was flawless, his form perfect, but none of that mattered when it came time to face real danger. The hesitation had taken everything. Shamed and defeated, Takashi could no longer face his family or the whispers of failure in Osaka. He left the city in silence, without a destination, simply walking away from everything he had once believed defined him. Days later, deep in the mountains, Takashi stumbled upon a small shrine. There, sitting calmly, as if he had been waiting for him, was the very Ronin who had defeated him. Takashi's anger flared, and his hand instinctively moved toward his sword, but the Ronin, without moving an inch, said simply, "Sit." Takashi was confused. "You humiliated me," he spat. "No," the Ronin replied, "you humiliated yourself. I only revealed what was already true." The Ronin's words cut deeper than any blade. Takashi, in his anger, asked, "What do you mean? My technique is flawless. I have trained for years." The Ronin replied, "Your training is performance. Beautiful to watch, yes, but useless under pressure. You hesitate. That is why you lost." Takashi stood silent, his mind racing, trying to reconcile his flawless technique with the crushing truth that his hesitation had cost him everything. The Ronin then spoke of a different kind of training, one that went beyond the blade, one that could not be learned in a dojo. He promised to teach Takashi what he had learned from the great Miyamoto Musashi, but only if Takashi was willing to unlearn what he thought he knew. Takashi knelt. "I am willing," he said. "Good. We begin at dawn," the Ronin replied. The first lesson Takashi received was a simple one, yet it was the hardest of all. At the break of dawn, the Ronin's voice echoed through the cold morning air, "Stand." Takashi, exhausted from the previous day's training and his mind foggy, he opened his mouth to protest, but the Ronin's gaze stopped him. "You rise now, without negotiation, no excuses, no second guessing. A blade does not warm up before it cuts. The sun does not ask permission before it rises. Why do you treat your warrior path like an option?" Takashi, confused but determined, rose from the ground. The task wasn't about physical strength, it was about the mental act of committing to the moment without hesitation. In his past training, Takashi had always negotiated with himself. Every morning he would debate whether he was truly ready to train, whether his body needed rest, or if he had the energy to keep going. But the Ronin's discipline was different. The warrior path begins the moment you decide to act. It is not the hour or the form, but the act of beginning. Takashi attempted to rise with no thought, no hesitation, but it took him many tries. With each failed attempt, he learned to focus solely on the action itself, not on the thoughts or feelings that distracted him. It was in the first moment of every day where true discipline began, not in the grand actions, but in the decision to rise without hesitation. As the days passed, Takashi learned the second discipline, moving without emotion. He had already learned that hesitation would cost him, but now he was learning how emotions could cloud his judgment. During sparring practice, the Ronin insulted Takashi's family, telling him that his father had disowned him, that his sensei had called him a failure, that the dojo had mocked his name. Takashi's fists clenched, his body tensed, and his mind began to cloud with rage. He wanted to strike, to let his anger fuel his sword, but the Ronin saw through him. "Emotion controls you," the Ronin said, lowering his weapon. "In a real duel, an opponent will try to make you angry. Angry men fight recklessly. Reckless fighters die." The Ronin circled Takashi, who stood trembling with fury. "You are reacting to my words as if they are truth, but words are just that, words. They carry no power unless you give them power. When you act from emotion, you lose clarity. The blade must cut because it must, not because it wants to." Takashi understood that his emotions, while real, were not his master. He learned to feel his anger, acknowledge it, but not to act from it. He learned that the true warrior does not allow his emotions to control his actions, but instead uses his emotions to sharpen his blade and his mind. The third discipline was perhaps the hardest yet. The Ronin forced Takashi to train when every part of him wanted to rest. One morning, a fierce monsoon storm swept through the mountains. The rain poured down in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees. Takashi's body ached from the previous day's training, and his mind screamed for rest. But Kensei was already outside, moving through his sword forms as if the storm didn't exist. Takashi hesitated for a moment, his body begging for warmth and shelter, but the Ronin's words echoed in his mind. "The training you do when you don't want to, that is what builds the warrior." Reluctantly, Takashi stood, dressed in his wet clothes, and walked into the storm. For 3 hours, he trained with the Ronin in the pouring rain, not stopping once. There were no complaints, no rest, just movement. After the training, soaked to the bone, Takashi asked the Ronin, "Why do we do this? Why not rest when we need it?" Kensei replied, "Anyone can train when inspired. The true test of a warrior is whether they can train when they don't feel like it. When the body screams for rest, that's when the true warrior continues. The path doesn't wait for you to feel ready. It asks if you are willing to endure." Takashi understood that true discipline was not about doing what was easy or comfortable. It was about doing what needed to be done, no matter how difficult it was. It was in those moments of resistance that a warrior's strength was forged.